We're getting right into the next build for Jurassic Park Japan in Jurassic World Evolution 2. This video is all about building a huge sauropod habitat with 3 waterfalls, 2 bridges, 1 huge lake, and thousands of rocks, just the way I like it. I started off with like a bit of terraforming to get the rough shape and, terrain elevation figured out. And then as you can see here, I started work with the placeable decorative water. I use this water as opposed to the actual functional watery type of water in the game, because this actually allows me to vary the depth, which is going to be very important because later on for the big lake, I really want to achieve that Loch Ness type of effect where the sauropods are just poking out of the water with their necks, their bodies fully submerged. Now, the first waterfall of this habitat is already done, and you can see it in the background there. It's the tall waterfall, and then there's like this little plateau where the first bridge crosses over, and then there's going to be a shorter waterfall leading into the level below that. And this is just the start of the absolute insane amount of rocks that I've placed for this build and that I've placed for this park overall. I don't use the word insane lightly here. I think it's genuinely crazy just how many rocks there are in this bit. It's concerning. Send help. Basically, I spent an hour just placing rocks to cover up like all of the cliff faces all around that I created, but we'll get into my specific type of madness in a little bit. First, I want to place the waterfalls. I'm just, maneuvering the rocks to get them at the right position, and then using several of the placeable waterfalls to get that nice broad cascade down from one level to the one below that. The waterfalls are sometimes a little tricky to work with. What I recommend is what I'm doing right here, which is place them one at a time. And after you've placed the waterfall, don't move your cursor, get into Kai's toolbox and grab the waterfall, because they can be a little iffy to grab otherwise. So this is the third waterfall of the habitat, and it's even shorter than the one we just made. Of course, you start with like a foundation of rocks, as honestly, as far as foundations go, rocks are a pretty solid way to go, and that's a double joke right there. Anyway, so yeah, started off again with rocks and then placing the waterfalls on top of that. And this is just, this is quite a short waterfall. And what we're gonna do, like, behind me, or actually maybe right where the camera is right now, we're going to be building the second bridge. So that second bridge is going to have a really nice viewpoint of the huge lake. It's going to be right by this little waterfall. So that's just going to give a really good perspective into the park. Not into the park. Well, yeah, sure. This habitat is so big, you might as well refer to it as the park. But yeah, into the habitat. So very important for making the waterfalls look great is by adding these spray pieces. Now, initially, what I used to do is only add the spray to the bottom, but I actually feel like it also helps a lot to add that spray effect to the top of the waterfall, where the white water effect would really start as gravity takes its hold, and it sort of hides how the water really neatly clips into, or hides how the waterfall really neatly clips into the water. So the next step is to shape out the shape of the river and the shape of the lake, and it's not the perfect shape that I would have liked, but it is just what fits this habitat the best. I had a starting point for the river, which was right here with these 2 waterfalls, and I had an end point of the river, which is at the edge of the map, right there. And I knew I had to get from point A to point B, and at a certain point there had to be the big honkin' lake. So I was sort of limited in what I could do there. But I feel like overall it works out. We've reached the insane portion of this video where, yeah, I spent an hour doing this. Just just an hour doing this. So how I go about like covering cliff faces with rocks is what you're seeing me do right now is I turned off random rotation. I angled the rock so that there's a pretty flat side pointing up, and just really more or less neatly line the top edge of the cliff face with the rock in that position. And then what I'm doing right here is just filling out the rock wall with, you know, random rotation is back on, but I'm also purposefully turning the rock certain way to get the coverage that I want. This is very boring. This is very time consuming. I do feel like let's call it a trick. It's not really a trick, but I do feel like the trick of adding foliage to it later does a lot in hiding how messy this looks. Because obviously, a real cliff face would be a little bit neater, a little bit more smooth. But yeah, I don't want to spend, you know, 4 hours building a smooth cliff face. So it is what it is. I did mix in one other rock type just to mix the color a little bit, but I didn't spend too much, honestly, on like varying the types of rock, the color of the rock, the size of the rock, because again, we're adding foliage to this later, and it's gonna cover up like, I don't know, maybe 50% of the rock that we actually see. And by breaking it up with foliage, you get rid of like repetitive textures and stuff like that. In my opinion, it really won't be noticeable anymore at that point. So that's what we're doing right here, using my favorite fluffy tree and Kai's toolbox to sort of clip those into the rock face and make it look like, you know, there's stuff growing on the rocks. Unfortunately for me, now that we have the tools to place rocks this way to cover our cliff faces, the textures don't really cut it anymore for me, so I've kind of doomed myself to doing this every single time I create a cliff. And if you've been with the channel for a long time, even back in my unmodded days, you know that one of the most important things, I think at least, to good park design is terrain elevation differences. So cliffs are a big part of my builds in general. They're definitely a big part of Jurassic Park Japan. So yeah, I've doomed myself to a lot of this sort of rock work, and then, you know, the next step of adding foliage. The willow tree is one of my favorites to add to that. I do think that as far as Jurassic Park Japan goes, the biggest work in terms of the placement of rocks like this is probably done. God, here's hoping, here's hoping. I do think it's worth the effort. I think it looks a lot better than just the terrain textures, but it is a lot of work and it is boring work. I actually want to talk a little bit about the fact, you know, how much work it is. It's not difficult, but it is time consuming, and that's a struggle for me with like this weekly series. If you've been here since like Mini Nublar, Mini Sorna, Mini Manticore Island, my unmodded park building series, I was able to do those episodes once a week fairly easily. Like I might have skipped like a week once or twice, but yeah, the schedule was fairly regular there. But how I approached those builds was literally, I would build for 1 hour, and I could build something to fill an entire episode. Like I could build a habitat with the surrounding guest section, and then that will be the episode. So 1 hour building, and then I'd spend like a day editing that, and you'd have an episode. Whereas with modded building, it takes so much more time. And also, I'm a very slow builder. This isn't just a mod thing. This is an Evo mod thing. Evo plus mods is bigger than the sum of parts, because I am very slow when it comes to working with mods. So, you know, it's not a case of spending an hour building something and then spending a day editing it. I spent like a day building something and then a day editing, and that isn't really working. So today's video, very little editing, is just like a rough speed build, but I had to do it this way in order to get an episode out this week, especially since like this habitat is such a huge surface area. While I've been rambling, past Evo, bless her, has been placing this like these wall sections to create a perimeter where the habitat is actually at level with the surrounding guest area. And I went with these chunky wall pieces as opposed to just using like, you know, one of the many modded fence options that we have. Because for sauropods, I feel like this huge wall is appropriate. And I felt like all of the other walls felt a little wimpy. They didn't have the bulk that I was looking for our bulky sauropods. So that's why I went with this one. You know, it's not something I'm going to be doing all over the place. And I have to break up the repetitiveness of it a little bit as I go into like building out the surrounding guest area. But as a base, I feel like this worked better than just a regular fence. And what I'm doing here is I'm using like 2 open gate there was a little pause there where I was thinking. But yeah, there's like 2 open gate bits where, you know, I want to take a path through, get guests at like level with the sauropods and give them that experience that, you know, they're looking up at the sauropods. Because right now, the way you look into this habitat is either from the elevated path on top of like the cliff face or the elevated perspective from the bridges. So in both those cases, you're looking down at the sauropods. And I do feel like that is a very nice, majestic way to look into the habitat. But I also think it's really fun to give our guests the experience where, you know, they feel dwarfed by the sauropods. So that's what this is going to be. Unfortunately, I didn't even have time to finish this guest section or any of the guest sections. This episode is really just about building the actual habitat, and I did lay down like the path here, and I have an idea of what I want to do. I'm raising the terrain a little bit so that you're creating, you know, 2 different levels from which guests can look into the park, and then the upper level that's a little further back, that's where there's going to be a little seating section, maybe some food carts, something like that, just a little chill section. And then the path at the front is where the guests have that wow experience of, you know, if a sauropod comes by, you look up at the massive size of it. But I didn't have time to flesh any of this out if I wanted to be able to get this episode out, because the habitat itself was just so huge. And of course, this week, you know, there was news for Walking with the Dinosaurs. There was the video for Jurassic Park 3 that took me way longer because, you know, it's always a pain to get around Universal's copyright system, which I didn't manage to do, by the way. I still got a copyright claim. Great. Anyway, at this point, I'm rambling. I should get back on track here. The point is, I had to make some compromises, and I will probably have to make compromises in the future in order to do my best to make this a weekly series without compromising on what I'm actually building. So the compromise for today's episode is that it's just the habitat, not the surrounding sections, and the editing is, well, frankly, not there. There's no editing. It's just a really basic speed build with me rambling over top. But yeah, hopefully I can mix that a little bit. You know, next week when we do a smaller habitat, I hope to have the time to, you know, get back to, you know, the live building sections and stuff like that. But yeah, anyway, what was I talking about? This build. So at this point, I've added terrain paints, and right now I'm adding depth to the water. As I said earlier, I want to create that depth to get like that Loch Ness effect. And what I'm gonna do in there you go, I'm actually testing with the sauropods to see if it's deep enough, and that's something that's really handy about Kai's dinosaur placer tool. It just allows you to really quickly grab a dinosaur and check for size. So it's not even just about the ease of actually placing the dinosaur, but just a little size reference. All right, now we've reached I hesitate to use the word complicated, but I guess it is the most complicated part of this build, and that's really just because this whole build is as simple as placing rocks. But we're going to be building the first of the 2 bridges, and definitely the more complicated, more detailed of the 2 bridges. And for the flooring of the bridge, I'm using these wooden pieces. These are from an amphibian mod or something like that. So they're a piece in the amphibian mod. I will link everything as always in the Google Doc in the description box. But yeah, I'm just using these wall pieces. I'm placing a wall at the length that the bridge needs to be, and that was longer than I anticipated, so I kept having to go back in, place more pieces, use the tools to like perfectly move them along the same line to get them like perfectly straight. And then is it time? It is time. I'm selecting all of them and I'm moving it onto its side. Oh, no, it's still too short. Whoops. I think in the end, it still turned out too short, so I had to bring in the cliff. Anyway, so I'm turning it onto its side to turn it into the floor of the bridge. Now, unfortunately, or maybe it was a blessing in disguise, but unfortunately, the wall piece has like this thicker base and then a really thin strip at the top. So for a bridge, that's not symmetrical. You know, the left side and the right side aren't symmetrical that way. So I doubled the width of the bridge by adding a second line of these wall pieces turned into floor pieces. And I say blessing in disguise because I do feel like the bridge probably benefits from being extra thick, since it is a main thoroughfare in the park. So it would schmealism have to handle quite a bit of foot traffic, so it actually makes sense that it is twice as thick as I initially, you know, intended, with just one of these, like a one line of these pieces. So yeah, sometimes it just works out for the best. Unfortunately, lining these up perfectly was impossible. Initially, I wanted to line them up with the thin top strip in the middle, but since you can't line them up perfectly parallel, they're at like a slight angle, I had to line them up with the thick part in the middle, and I'm gonna hide that by putting planters down the entire center of it. So you really have a left lane and a right lane when it comes to this bridge. It's one of those compromises that you sometimes have to make because things don't turn out as you planned, as you envisioned. For the banister of the bridge, I'm using these wall pieces from my Japanese decoration mod, and I'm gonna sink them down just enough to be at like banister height for the bridge. And obviously, you know, right now we're sinking it into the ground. Once we move the bridge, we are going to be seeing those circular cutouts, but I actually think it looks quite nice. And I even like the height of the wall piece at the side of the bridge, because the bridge is so long, it does visually need that chonkiness to look like structurally sound, or at least, you know, pretend that it could be structurally sound. So that worked out quite well also. And the circular cutouts just, I guess, make it a little bit more interesting visually as well. I wouldn't say it's thematically the most Japanese or even Asian looking bridge. Like, obviously using the Japanese wall piece helped in that regard with the blue tiling on top there. Overall, yeah, it's not super themed, but it's the best bridge that I could build. And is that the best bridge ever? No. Is that the most on-themed bridge ever? No. But it is my first attempt at building a custom bridge, so I was okay with how this turned out. I was actually quite happy with how this turned out, because initially I was gonna use one of the pre-made decoration bridges, but those were so small. I would have to like create little islands with the terrain to like cross the distance. So yeah, I had to make a custom bridge, and considering my limitations, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. So I've built the entire bridge just on level ground. I think that's the easiest way to work. Just build it on level ground and then select all of the pieces. Yeah, that's a little boring, that's a little finicky, but just build it the easy way on level ground, select all the pieces, and then move your bridge into place as I'm doing right here. And you can see that it is just ever so slightly too short to cross the actual distance. So I had to cheat a little bit and then use the terrain tools to sort of bump the cliff a little bit closer to the start of the bridge so that I could cross the distance. Look, you know me, I don't plan. I should, but I don't. So yeah, sometimes your bridge turns out to be a little shorter than intended, and you have to be flexible and you have to work with that. I think it turned out fine. Now looking at it that way, I realize, all right, this bridge is gonna need some supports. So I was procrastinating by placing the lanterns first. I was like mentally preparing myself for, okay, how am I gonna do this? How am I gonna give the bridge supports without making it overly complicated, like without using too many pieces? So then I figured, all right, we're gonna use the trusty white containers. And what I actually did was first use the path to create a template for a perfect arch. And then I placed the containers following the arch of the pathway as my guideline. And then once the arch is completed, I can use Kai's toolbox to select all these containers and turn them onto their side. I really think that that is the best way to build. Maybe it isn't. Again, I'm not the best builder, I'm not the fastest builder, but for me, this was how my brain could sort of wrap around it. So I built the support of the bridge lying on its side, got everything lined up the way I wanted it, then I selected all the pieces and turned it upright, and then moved it into position. And initially I was just gonna use this one arch, but I figured it would look a little prettier if I did the arch on both of the other sides as well, and it did indeed look better. So I'm just repeating the steps here, just following that same arch with the containers and then moving, like turning them upright and moving them into position. If you are struggling with like modded builds, I guess this is one of the very few tips I can give you. I think this worked quite well. I was able to figure this out. For some reason, the curve that I'm placing right here is gonna disappear. I don't know what happened there. That was just the game messing with my mind. So yeah, I grabbed this and it's gone. I guess what happened is maybe I didn't unselect the other arch. I have no idea. Here, I was like, I'm so confused. Where did my arch go? So I had to build like half an arch again and replace that. Thankfully, this is a really simple process. Now, I did only do like one row of these supports, but that's because the containers are so thick that I felt like that was enough. I didn't feel like I had to double up and do support left and right. I just did a line of support down the middle of the bridge. And yeah, I felt like that was sturdy enough. I didn't want it to look too heavy at the bottom. What am I doing right now? I actually don't remember. What am I doing right now? Hold on, let's think about this. Oh, I remember. Yeah. Okay, so this is a journey of discovery. So the bottom pieces of that wall that I used, you know, with the circular cutouts, looked a little wonky. Because there's blue tile on one part and then no blue tile under, like directly underneath the circle, and then blue tile again. So to even it out, I added the multi-wall piece at the bottom, and I feel like that looked a lot better. So I'm adding foliage, and we're getting into like the habitat build of this part of the habitat. I didn't record me building the second bridge, but the second bridge was really simple. It was just a case of using the glass pieces, turning them onto their side, and using the multi-wall pieces as banisters. And the reason I didn't record it, and the reason that second bridge is so simple, is because the second bridge uses the monorail track as a base, and the monorail track pillars disappear if you put an item like right by it, or in this case, right over it. So I had to use decoration pieces really sparingly. I had to use as few pieces as possible to cross the distance and then put that into position just right so that none of the hitboxes of the items that I used overlapped with the pillars of the monorail that I used as supports. So that's, yeah, it just wasn't an interesting part. Is this interesting? Me placing all its foliage? Probably not. I don't know. Look, we're just hanging out together, watching Pass Evo place all this stuff. But there you see the bridge right there. You know, just use glass as the flooring. The monorail track goes down the center, you know, for the scaredy cats, they can follow the concrete middle line, and the brave souls can walk over the glass on either side of that. But yeah, the rest of the habitat, or the rest of the video, is just going to be about placing foliage and placing rocks to fill out the habitat as much as possible. And it's such a huge habitat. Oh my gosh. So I feel like I did more of a rough pass through the habitat. You know, first going in with the individually placeable foliage, get that into the positions that I wanted to cover, and then going in with the foliage brush to sort of, you know, create more forested areas. But I kept most of it quite open because it is at the core of the park, and I really wanted to keep the view lines open. You know, I want to be able to stand on the bridge and look all the way to the Dragon's Den, you know, the arch of the Dragon's Den. And yeah, I just wanted to keep it open and keep that viewpoint. I'm taking a little detour to add one detail to the bridge we just built, and that is by adding these lanterns. And again, I'm just building it on the level ground and then moving it into position later. I just personally find that much easier to work with, but I'm hardly an expert when it comes to modded building. So just selecting all of them and moving them over into the center line of my bridge, and then it's just a little bit of fiddling to get them into position. But that's where, you know, Kai's toolbox is absolutely amazing. Like, you can just go into precise movement and just perfectly put them into their place. So I think this is probably the last step, adding some rocks all the way around. Now what I want to do when I get around to like building the surrounding guest areas, I want to choose certain points where I'm going to build like a viewing tower or even a viewing gallery, and really focus on beautifying those exact viewpoints. But I struggled like perfecting the entire habitat because it is so huge. I definitely got overwhelmed. So yeah, it's just a case of some patches of forests, some random rock placements, and, you know, just the sheer size of it, the rock face, the waterfalls, the lakes, those are doing the heavy lifting when it comes to looking pretty. I've rambled long enough, so I'm gonna shut up for the showcase. If you've somehow enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and of course subscribe for future episodes for Jurassic Park Japan, and a lot more in the meantime. Thank you so much for watching, liking, subscribing, and until next time, enjoy the game.